I drained every last penny of my retirement accounts to give my daughter the fairy tale wedding she had always begged for. But when her secretive new in-laws showed up on my front porch with forged legal papers and told me my house belonged to them now, I realized the beautiful ceremony I just paid for was actually a carefully orchestrated heist. My name is Helen Gallagher. I am 54 years old, and I work as a payroll manager for a mid-sized dental supply company. Before I tell you how I turned my daughter's lavish wedding into a federal fraud investigation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. Now let me take you back to the exact moment I signed my life away. For 26 years, my entire universe revolved around my daughter, Lily. I raised her completely on my own after her father walked out when she was barely a toddler. I worked 50-hour weeks managing payroll, meticulously tracking every dime so she would never feel the sting of growing up with a single mother on a tight budget. I drove a 15-year-old sedan with a rattling engine so she could have braces. I packed my lunches in plastic containers for a decade so she could go to summer gymnastics camp. I shopped at discount stores and clipped coupons just so Lily could wear the same popular brands as the kids from two-parent households. I thought that was what a good mother did. I thought love meant giving until you had absolutely nothing left to give. I never expected that my lifetime of sacrifice was just conditioning her to take everything I had without a second thought. The real trouble started the day we sat down to plan the wedding. Lily was engaged to Todd Sterling, a 28-year-old man she met at an art gallery fundraiser. Todd was charming, polished, and supposedly came from old money. His parents, Richard and Beatrice Sterling, practically dripped with wealth. They wore designer clothes that cost more than my monthly mortgage, drove luxury European cars, and spoke with the kind of casual arrogance reserved for people who never have to look at price tags. Naturally, when the topic of paying for the wedding came up, I assumed we would split the costs. I had saved $15,000 over the years specifically for Lily's special day. It was a modest amount, but certainly enough for a beautiful, intimate ceremony and a lovely reception with our closest family and friends. We were sitting in this private dining room of a very exclusive country club overlooking a pristine golf course. Beatrice swirled her sparkling water, her massive diamond ring catching the light, and looked at my printed budget spreadsheet like it was something foul she had stepped on. Helen Beatrice said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy and sharp condescension. "We simply cannot host a Sterling family event on a backyard barbecue budget. Our friends are corporate executives and state politicians. They expect a certain standard of elegance. We are looking at a minimum of $75,000 for the venue, the floral arrangements, and the catering alone. Anything less would be an absolute embarrassment." I felt my stomach drop to the floor. $75,000 was more than I made in an entire year. I looked at Richard across the table, expecting him to pull out a checkbook and offer his share of this extravagant demand. Instead, he smoothed his silk tie, took a slow sip of his expensive scotch, and sighed heavily. "I would love to write a check right now, Helen. Truly, I would. But unfortunately, the bulk of our liquid assets are temporarily tied up in a high-yield overseas trust. We are restructuring our investment portfolio, and the tax penalties for withdrawing early are astronomical. We are completely illiquid for the next 8 months. We simply cannot access the cash right now." It sounded like sophisticated financial jargon meant to confuse me, but before I could even process the absurdity of rich people claiming they had no money, Lily immediately rushed to their defense. "Mom, please," Lily pleaded, her eyes welling with tears as she reached across the table to grab my hand. "You know Todd's parents are good for it. They just have their money tied up right now. This is my one chance to have a real society wedding. I have dreamed of this my entire life, You cannot embarrass me in front of them and all their important friends. I tried to explain reason. I kept my voice low, not wanting to make a scene in the quiet dining room. I told her I did not have $75,000. I told her I was just a payroll manager who had worked hard just to keep a roof over our heads. That was when Lily started crying in earnest. She pulled her hand away from mine and accused me of being selfish. She said I was ruining her life and trying to sabotage her future because I was bitter and jealous that she was marrying into a successful family. The Sterlings just sat there in their tailored suits, watching me break under the weight of my own daughter's emotional manipulation. Beatrice leaned in, resting her manicured hand on the table, and whispered that perhaps I could dip into my retirement savings. "It is an investment in your daughter's social standing, Helen," she said smoothly. "You cannot put a price on her happiness." Driven by blind maternal guilt and the sheer terror of losing my daughter's love, I caved. The pressure in that room was suffocating, and the look of pure disappointment on Lily's face broke my heart. The very next morning, I walked into my local bank and did the one thing every financial advisor tells you never to do. I sat down with a teller and told them to cash out my entire retirement account. When the bank teller asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to withdraw the full amount, her eyes were filled with genuine concern. She warned me about the massive tax implications and the harsh early withdrawal penalties. I wanted to tell her to stop, to cancel the transaction, to protect my future. But the image of Lily crying in that country club dining room flashed in my mind. I signed the authorization forms with a trembling hand. I watched the computer screen as the balance of my life's work dropped to zero. It felt like watching my own heart monitor flatline. I took the severe tax hit and watched 26 years of my hard-earned safety net vanish into a single cashier's check. I felt physically sick. A heavy cold knot of anxiety sat in my chest, making it hard to breathe. But when I handed that check over to the country club coordinator later that afternoon and saw Lily jump up and down with absolute joy, I pushed the terror down. I told myself it was worth it. I was securing her happiness. I was giving her the life she deserved. Fast forward to 2 days before the wedding. The stress level in my house was absolutely suffocating. I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, trying to coordinate the florist, the caterers, the seating chart, and the transportation, because the Sterlings refused to lift a single finger to help with the actual labor of planning. My dining room table was buried under a mountain of silk ribbons, place cards, seating arrangements, and vendor contracts. The phone was ringing constantly. I was exhausted to my very bones. The doorbell rang loudly, startling me. I opened it to find Todd standing on my front porch, carrying a thick stack of legal documents clipped to a heavy wooden clipboard. He looked frantic, his hair messy, breathing heavily, as if he had run all the way to my door. He pushed his way into the hallway and told me the country club was threatening to cancel the entire event if we did not get the vendor insurance forms and venue liability waivers signed and notarized immediately. He said the club manager had changed their corporate policy at the last minute and absolutely needed the primary financial sponsor to sign off on the property damage waivers. I was completely overwhelmed. My head was pounding with a severe migraine. I had the head caterer on hold on my cell phone, aggressively demanding to know if we were choosing the sea bass or the filet mignon for the VIP tables. Todd shoved a black pen into my hand. He flipped rapidly through the thick stack of papers, pointing to several bright yellow sticky notes he had placed at the bottom of the pages. "Just sign right here on the tabs, Helen," he said, his voice urgent and rushing me. "I have a mobile notary waiting in the car outside to stamp them. If we don't get these scanned and emailed back to the venue director in exactly 20 minutes, they are locking us out of the ballroom and canceling the catering order." I should have read them. I have worked in payroll and corporate administration for 30 years. I know better than anyone that you never sign a legal document without reading the fine print. But this was my future son-in-law. This was the man who was going to protect and take care of my daughter for the rest of her life. And I was in a state of sheer blinding panic over the thought of the $75,000 wedding being canceled at the last possible second. I did not stop to read the tiny print at the top of the 4th page. I did not notice that the document was not printed on the country club's official letterhead. I just signed my name exactly where the yellow sticky notes pointed, my hand moving automatically. I handed the clipboard back to him with a heavy sigh of relief. Todd snatched the papers eagerly, gave me a quick, stiff hug, and ran out the front door without another word. I went back to arguing with the caterer on the phone, completely unaware that I had just handed over the keys to my entire life. The wedding day itself was undeniably spectacular. It looked like a glamorous multi-page spread out of a luxury bridal magazine. There were towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported roses, a live string quartet playing softly in the background, and a decadent 5-course meal served on gold-rimmed china. The Sterlings floated around the grand ballroom, holding glasses of expensive champagne, accepting glowing compliments from their wealthy friends, as if they had personally financed every single detail. I sat quietly at table number 9, pushed near the kitchen doors, far away from the Sterling family's prominent head table. I watched Richard and Beatrice toast to their family's enduring legacy, taking full credit for the lavish event I had bought, with my literal blood, sweat, and tears. I ate my dinner mechanically, not tasting a single bite. Every flower arrangement, every crystal glass, every note played by the string quartet represented a month of my life spent working overtime, a vacation. I never took a winter where I kept the heat turned down to save a few dollars. But when I watched Lily and Todd sway across the polished dance floor for their first dance, looking so perfectly in love under the crystal chandeliers, I forced myself to smile. I pushed away the creeping dread in my stomach. I told myself that the completely empty bank accounts did not matter. I had given my daughter the fairy tale dream she had always wanted. At midnight, I stood on the grand stone steps of the country club, with the rest of the guests holding a sparkler and waving as Lily and Todd drove off in a rented vintage Rolls-Royce for their honeymoon. I drove home to my quiet, empty house in my rattling sedan. I walked through my front door, kicked off my painful heels, and sank into my worn-out couch. I was completely broke, facing my golden years with absolutely zero savings and nothing to fall back on. But I felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. I thought the hard part was finally over. I thought I could finally catch my breath, go back to my quiet job, and start slowly rebuilding my life one paycheck at a time. But the hangover of that beautiful, expensive wedding was about to become a literal waking nightmare. And the men who would show up on my front porch the very next morning would teach me exactly what kind of ruthless, calculating family my daughter had married into. The morning after the wedding was the quietest my house had been in over a year. I woke up just as the sun began to filter through the blinds of my bedroom window. My body ached with the kind of deep, bone-deep exhaustion that comes from months of relentless stress finally leaving your system. The house was completely silent. There were no caterers calling, no florists demanding last-minute changes, no hysterical crying fits over table linens or seating charts. It was over. The fairy tale had been purchased, delivered, and executed flawlessly. I dragged myself out of bed and walked down the hallway to the kitchen. My bare feet padded against the worn oak floorboards. I had lived in this house for 24 years. I bought it right after Lily was born, using every penny I had scraped together from working overtime and weekend shifts. It was a modest 3-bedroom property in a quiet neighborhood, but to me it was a castle. I had spent 2 decades aggressively paying down the principal. Every bonus, every tax refund, every spare dollar went straight into the mortgage until I finally owned it free and clear. It was my fortress. It was the one piece of absolute security I possessed in a world that had never been easy on a single mother. I brewed a pot of cheap coffee, ignoring the expensive wedding favors still sitting in boxes by the door. I poured a mug, sat down at the small wooden kitchen table where Lily used to do her middle school homework, and opened the banking application on my phone. I needed to assess the damage. I needed to see exactly what reality looked like now that the magic of the wedding night had faded. The screen loaded, and the numbers stared back at me in harsh, stark, digital ink. The checking account held $42. The savings account held $17. The retirement account was a completely flat zero. I stared at those numbers for a long time. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, twisting tight. 26 years of careful planning wiped out. But as I took a sip of the bitter coffee, I forced myself to take a deep, steadying breath. I rationalized it the only way a desperate mother could. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that money was meant to be used, and I had used it to buy my daughter a lifetime of happiness. She was safely married into a powerful family. She would never have to worry about clipped coupons or budget groceries. And I still had my health, my job, and my paid-off house. I could rebuild. I would start over on Monday. I was just starting to convince myself that everything would be okay when I heard the heavy, unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel outside my front window. I frowned, glancing at the clock on the stove. It was barely 8 in the morning on a Sunday. I stood up and walked to the front window, pulling back the edge of the curtain. A massive black SUV with heavily tinted windows was idling directly in my driveway. It was the kind of luxury vehicle that looked entirely out of place on my working-class street. It looked hostile. It looked predatory. The engine cut off. The heavy doors unlatched. Richard and Beatrice Sterling stepped out onto my driveway. They were dressed in sharp, immaculate clothing, looking less like people recovering from a wedding and more like corporate raiders arriving for a hostile takeover. Richard wore a tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt. Beatrice wore a designer trench coat and oversized black sunglasses that hid half her face. But they were not alone. 2 enormous men in dark, ill-fitting suits stepped out of the back doors. They had the thick, imposing builds of private security. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter in my chest. Why were they here? Why did they have security guards? A completely irrational thought crossed my mind, that perhaps there had been an accident on the way to the airport. Perhaps something had happened to Lily and Todd. I rushed to the front door, pulling it open before they even reached the porch steps. Richard. I said, my voice tight with sudden worry. Beatrice, is everything all right? Is Lily okay? Beatrice did not say hello. She did not take off her sunglasses. She walked right past me, pushing into my foyer without an invitation, her expensive heels clicking sharply against my hardwood floors. She looked around my modest home with an expression of open disgust, as if the very air inside my house was offensive to her. The 2 security men stepped up onto the porch, positioning their massive frames directly in my doorway, blocking the exit. Richard followed his wife inside. He was holding a thick manila folder in his right hand. He did not look worried. He looked incredibly calm, his face set in a cold, rigid mask of absolute authority. Richard, what is going on? I asked, my voice rising in pitch. Why are you here? Richard walked past me and stepped into the kitchen. He stood over the wooden table where I had just been drinking my coffee. He raised his hand and dropped the manila folder onto the tabletop. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack that echoed through the quiet house. You have exactly 7 days to vacate the premises, he said. His voice was completely flat. There was no emotion, no hesitation. It was a simple statement of fact. I froze. The words bounced around my brain, refusing to connect to reality. I stared at him, my coffee mug trembling slightly in my hand. I let out a nervous, confused laugh. I am sorry. What did you just say? You have 7 days. Richard repeated, his eyes locking onto mine with the cold precision of a reptile. After next Sunday, any personal belongings left inside this property will be considered abandoned and disposed of by our contractors. We have a renovation team coming in on Monday morning to gut the interior. I looked from Richard to Beatrice, expecting her to roll her eyes and tell me it was some bizarre joke. But Beatrice was running a manicured finger over my floral wallpaper, clearly calculating how fast she could tear it down. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Vacate my premises? I asked, my voice shaking. Richard, have you lost your mind? This is my house. I own this house. I have lived here for 24 years. You need to get out of my home right now before I call the police. Richard did not move. He reached down and flipped open the cover of the manila folder. He pulled out a crisp, professionally printed document and slid it across the wooden table toward me. You do not own anything, Helen, Richard said softly. You have not owned this property for 48 hours. I stepped slowly toward the table. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to vibrate before my eyes. Quitclaim deed. I read the text beneath it. It was a formal legal transfer of property. It listed the physical address of my home, the exact parcel number, and the legal description of the land. In the section detailing the grantor, the person giving away the property was my full legal name, Helen Marie Gallagher. And in the section detailing the grantee, the entity receiving the property, was a name I had never seen before. Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. The room began to spin. I looked at the bottom of the second page. There, in stark blue ink, was my signature, my exact signature. Right next to it was a bright red official notary stamp with a signature across the seal. I stared at the blue ink of my own name. A sudden violent flashback hit me with the force of a physical blow. 2 days ago. The absolute chaos of the dining room. The caterer screaming on the phone about the sea bass. The mountain of silk ribbons. Todd rushing through the front door, sweating and frantic, holding a heavy wooden clipboard. Todd telling me the country club was going to cancel the wedding if I did not sign the venue liability waivers and vendor insurance forms immediately. Todd aggressively flipping through a massive stack of papers, pointing frantically to bright yellow sticky notes. Just sign right here on the tabs, Helen. I have a mobile notary waiting in the car outside. Todd, my new son-in-law, the man I had entrusted with my daughter's entire future. He had slipped a quitclaim deed directly into a stack of fake country club insurance forms. He had orchestrated the entire panic. He had manipulated my desperation to save the wedding, knowing I was too exhausted and distracted to read the fine print. Oh my God, I whispered. The sound barely escaped my throat. A cold, visceral terror gripped my chest. I backed away from the table, my hands flying to my mouth. You tricked me. Todd tricked me. He hid this in the vendor papers. This is fraud. This is a crime. Beatrice finally spoke. She turned away from the wall and looked at me, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on her lips. It is not fraud, Helen. It is a business transaction. You signed the document freely and willingly. You transferred the asset to our corporate holding company. You stole my house, I screamed, my voice finally breaking through the shock. You stole my home. I am calling the police. I am calling a lawyer. I am going to have you all thrown in jail for forgery." Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. He casually buttoned his suit jacket, looking at me with the absolute pity of a predator observing trapped prey. "Go ahead," Helen, Richard sneered, taking a step toward me. "Call the police. Call every lawyer in the city. Tell them you voluntarily signed a legally binding document. Tell them you allowed a licensed notary public to witness your signature. The notary will testify that you were completely lucid and aware of your actions. It is fully notarized and legally ironclad. The title has already been recorded with the county clerk." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper. "If you try to fight this, we will drag you through the court system for a decade. We have millions in a legal defense fund. We will tie you up in civil litigation until you cannot afford to buy groceries. We will bankrupt you, Helen. You will lose every appeal, and you will end up sleeping in your rattling piece of junk car. Take the 7 days. Pack your clothes. Walk away quietly, and we will not charge you for the legal fees we incur processing the eviction." I could not breathe. My lungs refused to expand. I looked at the 2 massive security guards standing in my doorway, ensuring I could not run, ensuring I could not fight back. I had emptied my retirement account. I had handed over my life savings to buy them their perfect wedding. I had bankrupted my own future for their vanity. And they had repaid me by stealing the very roof over my head. Well, what about Lily? I gasped, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheeks. Does she know about this? Did you do this to my daughter? Beatrice laughed, a sharp musical sound that cut straight through my heart. Oh, Helen, you really are tragically naive. Our son is a very smart man. He requires a partner who understands the family business. Lily is a very fast learner. She understands how wealth is actually built. The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. They were not hiding this from Lily. They were confident Lily would simply go along with it. Or worse, Lily already knew. The thought of my own daughter, the child I had sacrificed my entire existence to protect, being complicit in my destruction, was too massive to comprehend. It shattered the last remaining pillar of my sanity. "We will be back next Sunday at 9 in the morning, Richard said, picking up the manila folder and tucking it neatly under his arm. "The security team will be here to ensure the property is fully vacated. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Helen. You played your part. The wedding is over. Now it is time to exit the stage." Richard and Beatrice turned and walked toward the front door. The 2 security men stepped aside to let them pass, then followed them out onto the porch. The heavy wooden front door closed behind them with a loud final click. I stood frozen in the center of my kitchen. Through the window, I watched the black SUV reverse out of my driveway and disappear down the quiet suburban street. The silence of the house came rushing back, but it was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the scuffed oak floorboards I had meticulously swept for 24 years. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around myself, and began to hyperventilate. The edges of my vision turned black. I was 54 years old. I had $0 in my bank account. I had $0 in retirement. My daughter was on a luxury honeymoon on the other side of the world, and I had exactly 7 days before I became completely homeless. In a single weekend, I had lost my money, my child, and my home. The fairy tale was dead. The nightmare had just begun. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut, sealing me inside a house that legally no longer belonged to me. Through the sheer curtains of my living room window, I watched the massive black vehicle reverse out of my driveway and glide down the quiet suburban street. It took my security, my dignity, and my entire future with it. The silence Richard and Beatrice left behind was not peaceful. It was a suffocating, heavy pressure that pressed against my chest and made the room spin violently. I was 54 years old, a payroll manager who had played by the rules her entire life, and I was about to be completely homeless in 7 days. I stumbled backward until the back of my knees hit the edge of the sofa. I collapsed onto the worn fabric cushions, my hands trembling so uncontrollably I could barely maintain a grip on my cell phone. I unlocked the screen, my fingers slipping against the smooth glass. I navigated to my contacts and dialed Lily. She was in Bora Bora. She had to be settling into her luxury overwater bungalow by now. She had to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the international ringing tone, a hollow and rhythmic sound that echoed the desperate, frantic pounding in my own chest. The call went straight to voicemail. I dialed again. It went to voicemail a second time. I listened to her cheerful, automated greeting, a voice I had loved more than my own life, and then I left a frantic, breathless message. I begged her to call me back immediately. I told her Richard and Beatrice had just been here with private security and a fake property deed. I babbled that Todd must have made a terrible mistake with the venue liability forms on the morning of the rehearsal. Even then, sitting in the absolute ruins of my life, I was making desperate excuses for them. I was clinging to the fragile hope that this was all just a massive, horrible misunderstanding. I called Todd next. His phone also went straight to voicemail. I opened my text messages and typed in all capital letters pleading for them to contact me right away because it was a severe emergency. I sent the message and stared at the bright screen waiting for the little gray bubbles to appear to show they were typing a reply. Nothing happened. The screen eventually timed out and went dark, leaving me staring at my own pale reflection. An hour passed in agonizing slowness. The house remained deadly quiet. The reality of what Richard Sterling had said began to crush the remaining oxygen out of my lungs. He had told me I had exactly 7 days to vacate the premises. He had promised that if I tried to fight the eviction, they would bankrupt me in court. They had millions of dollars and a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. I had exactly $42 in my checking account and $0 in my retirement fund. I was not a legal expert. I was just a mother who had loved her daughter too much. How could I possibly fight a notarized property transfer in front of a judge? The sheer paralyzing terror of my situation took over my entire body. I stood up on shaking legs and walked slowly into the garage. In the corner sat a stack of flattened cardboard boxes I had saved from a grocery delivery months ago. I grabbed them and dragged them across the concrete floor and into the living room. I pulled a roll of packing tape from a kitchen drawer. The loud, harsh screech of the tape tearing off the roll sounded like a scream in the quiet house. I walked over to the fireplace mantel and started pulling down the framed photographs one by one. There was a picture of Lily missing her 2 front teeth on her first day of kindergarten. There was a photo of her in her high school graduation gown, holding the diploma I had worked double shifts to help her earn. There was a picture of the 2 of us smiling brightly on a modest beach vacation I had financed by eating cheap noodles for 6 consecutive months. I threw the frames into the bottom of a cardboard box. I was sobbing uncontrollably now. The hot tears blurred my vision, making it incredibly hard to see the life I was systematically dismantling. I felt like I was digging my own grave with my bare hands. I thought about where I would go next Sunday when the private security team returned to throw me out onto the street. I could not afford the first and last month of rent on even the smallest, most run-down apartment in the city. I would have to live in my rattling 15-year-old sedan. I imagined packing my professional office clothes into the trunk and sleeping in brightly lit grocery store parking lots, terrified and hoping no one would notice me. The absolute horror of being a homeless senior citizen made my knees buckle completely. I sank to the floor, surrounded by empty cardboard boxes, clutching a silver-framed photo of my daughter, and praying she would call me back to save me from this nightmare. By noon, my phone finally buzzed against the hardwood floor. I practically threw myself across the carpet to grab it, my heart leaping into my throat. But it was not a text message from Lily. It was an automated notification from my home security application. A motion alert had been triggered on the front porch. The local mail carrier had just dropped off a bundle of envelopes. I stared at the notification, my brain completely numb with exhaustion, fear, and profound grief. I opened the application simply to clear the alert, so the annoying red notification badge would disappear from my home screen. The security interface loaded, showing a digital timeline of recorded motion clips from the past few days. I dragged my finger across the glass, scrolling past the clip of the mail carrier walking away. I swiped down, moving backward through the weekend timeline to clear out the older notifications. There was a clip from Saturday night when I returned exhausted from the wedding reception. There was a clip from Saturday morning when I left for the country club wearing my mother of the bride dress. And then my thumb stopped moving. There was a saved motion video from Friday morning, the morning of the wedding rehearsal. I stared at the small thumbnail image on my screen. It was Todd and Lily standing together on my front porch. I frowned, wiping the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. Todd was not supposed to see the bride the morning before the rehearsal dinner. They had explicitly told me they were following tradition and staying apart. That Friday morning was the exact moment he had shown up frantically at my door with his heavy wooden clipboard. He had told me the country club was canceling our reservation. I had signed those papers in a blind panic while dealing with a hostile catering manager on my cell phone. Lily was supposed to be upstairs in her bedroom getting her hair and makeup done, or so I had thought. My hands felt incredibly cold as I tapped the video file to play it. The footage loaded in crisp, high-definition color. The audio clicked on capturing the ambient sounds of the quiet suburban street and the cheerful chirping of morning birds. Todd was standing on the welcome mat, holding the thick clipboard tight against his chest. The front door opened slightly. Lily stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing the expensive white silk bridal robe I had purchased for her from getting ready photographs. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in loose, glamorous waves. I expected to hear a sweet, secret exchange between a young couple in love. I expected to hear him comforting her about the sudden venue insurance stress he was supposedly dealing with. I tapped the volume button on the side of my phone, turning it up to the absolute maximum level, so I could hear every single word they were saying. Todd looked over his shoulder, quickly checking the street to make sure no neighbors were watching them. He turned back to my daughter. His voice came through the camera microphone with crystal clear precision. Did she sign the deed? He asked the question flatly. There was absolutely no trace of the frantic, breathless panic he had shown me in the hallway just moments before. He sounded calm, calculated, and entirely relaxed. A cold chill washed over my skin, raising sharp goosebumps on my arms. I pulled the phone closer to my face, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Lily leaned against the doorframe. She did not look shocked by his question. She did not look horrified that her future husband was talking about a property deed instead of a venue waiver. She did not ask him what he meant. My beautiful daughter, the child I had sacrificed every personal joy in my life to raise, threw her head back and laughed. It was a cold, cruel, unfamiliar sound. It was the exact same mocking, arrogant laugh I had heard from Beatrice Sterling at the country club dining table. Yeah, Lily said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She didn't even read it. She is so desperate for me to look good in front of your parents she would sign away her soul. I stopped breathing. The words hit me with the kinetic force of a physical blow to the stomach. I stared at the bright screen, entirely unable to comprehend the monster wearing my daughter's face. Todd smirked, reaching out to wrap his free arm around her waist. "You are sure the notary stamp looks legit?" he asked, looking down at the papers on the clipboard. Lily rolled her eyes, playfully tracing a finger down his lapel. "Your cousin did a perfect job. It looks completely official." She was too busy yelling at the catering manager about sea bass to even look at the header. I just cannot believe she actually cashed out her entire retirement account for the floral budget. It is honestly pathetic. Todd kissed her forehead, smiling with a greedy, triumphant satisfaction. "Do not worry about her retirement, babe. Once we evict her and demolish this old dump, we are going to flip this lot for a fortune. Commercial zoning was just approved for this street. We will easily clear $1 million. Lily smiled. It was a bright, wicked, genuinely thrilled expression that made my stomach violently reject the coffee I had forced down earlier. "Perfect," she said. "Now go hide those papers in your car before she comes back outside. We have a rehearsal dinner to get to." The video clip ended. The screen faded to a dark black square. I sat alone on the floor of my living room, staring at my own pale, shocked reflection in the dark phone screen. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating. It was enlightening. It was a bright, glaring spotlight, illuminating the absolute truth of my entire existence. For 26 years, I had poured every ounce of my energy, my love, my money, and my soul into a completely empty vessel. I had believed I was raising a good, kind, loving woman who just wanted a beautiful life. I had believed her tears at the country club were born of genuine anxiety over fitting into high society. But she was never anxious. She was acting. She had deliberately colluded with a family of wealthy grifters to steal the very roof over my head. She knew exactly what Todd was doing with that clipboard. She knew about the fake notary stamp provided by his cousin. She had watched me drain my life savings to buy her imported flowers and a string quartet, knowing full well she was going to render me homeless the very next day. She viewed my unconditional maternal love as a pathetic weakness to be exploited for real estate capital. The weeping, helpless mother who had been hyperventilating on the floor died in that exact moment. The woman who had spent decades shrinking herself to make others comfortable, the woman who took the blame and carried the financial burdens to buy affection, evaporated into the cold morning air. The tears completely stopped falling. My breathing slowed down, no longer ragged and panicked. My heart stopped its erratic racing and settled into a steady, rhythmic, mechanical beat. A profound, icy calmness washed over my entire body. I stood up from the floor. My knees did not shake. My hands were perfectly still. I looked at the cardboard boxes I had dragged into the living room just an hour ago. I walked over to them and kicked them aside with my bare foot, sending them tumbling across the hardwood. I was not moving anywhere. I walked back to the kitchen table and picked up the fake quitclaim deed Richard Sterling had dropped in front of me with such supreme arrogance. I looked closely at the forged notary stamp and the fraudulent corporate entity name printed at the top. I picked up my phone, opened my security application, and made absolutely sure the video file of my daughter and her husband was saved in 3 different cloud storage locations. Helen Gallagher, the desperate victim, was gone forever. A cold, furious survivor took her place. I did not need to pack my belongings into garbage bags. I needed to pack evidence into legal briefs. I was going to find the sharpest lawyer in the state. I was going to contact the federal authorities, and I was going to burn their entire high society empire straight to the ground. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a single desk lamp burning, staring at the fraudulent quitclaim deed and the flash drive containing the security footage. By the time the sun came up, casting a gray and miserable light through the windows, I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a woman with a mission. At exactly 9 in the morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the most intimidating law firm in downtown Seattle. I had spent the early hours of the morning researching attorneys who specialized in high-asset property disputes and corporate fraud. I did not want a family lawyer who would hold my hand and offer me tissues. I wanted a shark. The man sitting across from me was named David. He was a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into high-stakes civil litigation, and he looked exactly like the kind of man who ate corporate bullies for breakfast. His office was a testament to his success, featuring polished mahogany minimal clutter and a wall of windows looking down on the city. I sat in a leather chair that felt entirely too expensive for a payroll manager, with $0 to her name, and I laid everything out on his pristine desk. I handed him the quitclaim deed, the venue insurance forms Todd had used as camouflage, and my phone with the video queued up. I gave him the entire story, without shedding a single tear. I told him about the $75,000 wedding, my drained retirement accounts, the sudden demand to vacate my own home, and the conversation caught on my front porch camera. I braced myself for the worst. I expected David to lean back, steep his fingers together, and tell me that, because I had signed the document of my own free will, I was legally doomed. I expected him to say that fighting a notarized deed was nearly impossible, and that I should just cut my losses and try to find a cheap apartment. Instead, David did not say a word about my foolishness. He picked up the quitclaim deed and stared at it with the intense, focused energy of a jeweler examining a potentially fake diamond. He ran his thumb over the red ink of the notary stamp. Then he looked at the signature of the notary public. He squinted, pulling the paper closer to the light. "What is your son-in-law's exact full name?" David asked, his voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "Todd Marcus Sterling," I replied, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. David turned to his computer monitor and began typing rapidly. He brought up a state licensing database for public notaries. The clicking of his keyboard was the only sound in the massive office for several long minutes. He clicked through a few screens, cross-referencing something on a different monitor, and then a slow, sharp smile spread across his face. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter catching a scent. "Helen," David said, turning the monitor so I could see the screen. "A notary public is legally required to be a neutral, unbiased third party. They cannot have a financial or close familial interest in the transaction they are witnessing. Do you know a man named Marcus Sterling Vance?" I shook my head, entirely confused. I have never heard that name in my life. Marcus Sterling. "Vance is the registered name of the notary who stamped your deed," David explained, tapping the screen with his pen. "According to the state registry and a quick search of public property records, Marcus Vance shares a permanent residential address with Beatrice Sterling. He is Todd's first cousin. This stamp is an enormous conflict of interest, which immediately casts a dark legal shadow over the validity of the transfer. But that is just the beginning of their mistakes." David pushed the deed aside and picked up a yellow legal pad. He wrote down the name of the entity that had claimed my home. Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC. He logged into the Secretary of State's corporate registry database and typed in the company name. I watched his eyes scan the lines of data that appeared. "You mentioned that Richard and Beatrice claimed to be from old money," David said, not looking away from the screen. "You said they boasted about overseas trusts and illiquid investment portfolios." "Yes," I answered, feeling a fresh wave of humiliation. That was their excuse for refusing to pay a single dime for their own son's wedding. They acted like writing a check was beneath their tax bracket. David let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Helen, there is no overseas trust. Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC is not a wealth management vehicle. It is a domestic shell company. It was incorporated in Delaware exactly 6 years ago using a registered agent service to hide the primary owners. But they were sloppy when they filed their annual reports in our state. Richard Sterling is listed as the sole managing member. My heart hammered against my ribs. So they are just pretending to be rich? I asked. They forced me to bankrupt myself for a country club wedding, just to keep up their own fake appearances. It is much worse than that, David said, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the desk. He clicked another button, pulling up county property records associated with the LLC. I want you to look at this. He turned the screen toward me again. There was a list of 4 different residential properties. The most recent one, at the top of the list, was my address. The other 3 were scattered across affluent suburbs in the neighboring counties. In the last 10 years, Sterling Estate Holdings has acquired 4 different properties using this exact same method, David explained, his voice growing hard. I just pulled the transfer histories for the other 3 houses. Every single one of them was transferred via a quitclaim deed. Every single one of them was stamped by the same notary, Marcus Vance. And every single previous owner was a widow over the age of 60. The breath completely vanished from my lungs. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I stared at the names of the previous owners listed on the screen. Mary Higgins, Clara Bowles, Evelyn Carmichael. 3 older women. 3 women who were likely living alone, managing their own finances, and fiercely protective of the homes they had paid off over decades. Just like me. They are not old money, Helen David said quietly, letting the absolute horror of the situation sink in. They are sophisticated professional grifters. They target vulnerable older women who have high equity in their homes. They use their charm, their fake displays of wealth, and clearly their own son to infiltrate families. They groom their victims, manufacture a high-stress financial emergency, and trick them into signing away their property rights. Then they evict the victim, demolish the property, and flip the commercial land to developers for millions. They have been doing this for a decade. You were simply their latest mark. And your daughter was the inside man who gave them the keys to the vault. The reality of my situation finally crystallized in my mind. The grand art gallery where Lily had met Todd was not a coincidence. It was a hunting ground. The sudden aggressive demand for a $75,000 wedding was not about high society standards. It was a deliberate strategy to drain my liquid cash so I would not have the funds to fight them in court when they inevitably stole my house. My own daughter, the child I had packed lunches for the child I had sacrificed my entire youth to provide for, had handed me over to a syndicate of serial con artists. She had traded her mother's home for a designer wedding dress and a country club reception. I looked at David. The tears were completely gone. The fear that had kept me paralyzed on my living room floor had evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning inferno of pure rage. How do we get it back? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with absolute steel. How do I get my house back from these monsters? David leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. We have options, he said carefully. The traditional route is to file a civil lawsuit. We petition the court to invalidate the quitclaim deed based on fraud, coercion, and the illegal conflict of interest with the notary public. We present the video from your security camera to prove malicious intent. We file an injunction to prevent them from selling or altering your house while the case is active. That sounds perfect, I said eagerly. Let us file it today. I want them out of my life. David held up a hand to stop me. You need to understand the reality of civil litigation, Helen. The Sterlings are professional criminals, which means they know exactly how to manipulate the legal system. They will hire aggressive defense attorneys. They will file endless motions to delay the proceedings. They will claim the video was taken out of context. A civil suit of this magnitude, especially involving corporate LLCs and property disputes, will take 3 to 5 years to resolve. During that time, your house will be locked in legal limbo. And because they drained your retirement accounts, you do not have the financial endurance to pay a legal team for 5 years of warfare. They know that. That is exactly why they target women in your financial position. They rely on you running out of money before you ever see the inside of a courtroom. I stared at him, the heavy weight of his words pressing down on my shoulders. 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years of living out of boxes, scraping by on my payroll manager's salary, while the people who destroyed my life slept soundly in their expensive stolen beds. I pictured Beatrice swirling her sparkling water. I pictured Richard arrogantly dropping that manila folder on my kitchen table. I pictured Lily, my own flesh and blood, laughing on the porch while discussing my financial ruin. A civil suit might eventually get me my house back, but it would not give me justice. It would just be a long, exhausting negotiation over stolen goods. I refuse to wait 3 years, I said, looking David directly in the eyes. I refuse to let them tie me up in paperwork while they look for their next victim. They took my entire life, David. They took my security. They took my daughter. I do not just want my house back. I want to take their freedom. David looked at me for a long, silent moment. The professional, detached demeanor of a civil attorney slowly slipped away, replaced by the sharp, predatory gleam of the federal prosecutor he used to be. A slow smile crept back onto his face. I was hoping you would say that, David replied, his voice dropping to a serious conspiratorial tone. Because civil court is about getting your money back. Federal court is about putting people in cages. He spun his computer monitor back around and pointed to the property records. The Sterlings do not just sit on these properties, Helen. They use them. Right now, they have a massive asset transferred into their LLC free and clear. People like Richard and Beatrice do not wait around. They leverage. They are undoubtedly going to use the stolen equity of your home as collateral to secure a massive commercial loan, probably to fund their next high-end real estate flip or to pay off previous debts. David leaned across the desk, his eyes burning with intensity. To get a commercial loan of that size, they have to submit applications to federal banks. They have to sign affidavits swearing they obtained the collateral property legally. They have to use electronic banking systems and interstate wire transfers. If they use a fraudulently obtained deed to secure a bank loan, they are no longer just committing a local civil offense. They are committing federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and potentially engaging in a racketeering enterprise. I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly clicking into place. We do not stop them from getting the loan, I said, the realization dawning on me. We let them apply for it. Exactly, David said, tapping his pen on the desk. We let them build their own trap. If we file a civil suit today, we tip our hand. They will immediately back off, dissolve the LLC, and slither away to avoid jail time. They might even give you the house back just to keep themselves out of a criminal investigation. But if we play dumb, if we let them believe you are exactly the broken, helpless, bankrupt victim they think you are, they will proceed with their plan. They will submit those fraudulent documents to the investors and the banks. And the moment they do, we hand this entire file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The plan was terrifying in its scope. I would have to endure their psychological torture. I would have to look the people who ruined my life in the eye and pretend I was utterly defeated. I would have to let them believe they had won all while secretly coordinating with federal agents to orchestrate their absolute destruction. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game of deception. But as I sat in that mahogany office thinking about the other 3 widows who had undoubtedly lost everything to these monsters, I knew I had no other choice. I looked at David, my jaw set with an unbreakable resolve. Tell me exactly what I need to do to play the perfect victim. The drive back to my house from David's law office felt entirely different than the drive there. Earlier that morning, I had been a shattered, terrified woman, clutching a steering wheel with trembling hands, wondering how I was going to survive sleeping in my car. Now, navigating the familiar suburban streets of my neighborhood, a profound and heavy stillness had settled into my bones. The torrential rain that usually made Seattle traffic a nightmare felt perfectly appropriate. I gripped the worn leather of my steering wheel and mentally prepared myself for the most difficult acting performance of my entire life. David had been absolutely clear about our strategy. To catch a family of professional grifters in a federal trap, I could not just act like a victim. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken casualty they expected me to be. I had to feed their massive egos until they choked on their own arrogance. I pulled into my driveway and parked exactly where Richard Sterling's luxury vehicle had idled just 24 hours prior. The house was quiet and cold. I walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and pulled out my cell phone. My thumb hovered over Richard's contact name. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to call the police, to scream into the receiver, to demand my property back. I had to swallow that burning pride like jagged glass. I took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of the devastating grief I had felt yesterday, and began to type a text message. I crafted the message meticulously, making sure to use the tone of a woman who had completely surrendered. I wrote that I was devastated and terrified. I told him that I had looked at my bank accounts and realized I had absolutely nothing left after paying for the wedding venue and the floral arrangements. I typed that I had spent the entire morning calling low-income housing offices, but the wait lists were years long, and I simply could not afford the security deposit on a cheap studio apartment. I begged him, pleading with a pathetic desperation that made my own stomach turn for a 30-day extension to the eviction notice. I said I just needed a few more weeks to figure out how to survive. I ended the message by saying I knew I had no legal rights and that I was completely at his mercy. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before I pressed send. Sending that message felt like a betrayal of my own dignity, but David had promised me it was the bait we needed. Now the agonizing wait began. I paced the length of my living room, stepping over the cardboard boxes I had abandoned. An hour passed. Then 2. I forced myself to make a sandwich I could not taste, just to keep my hands busy. I knew exactly how psychological warfare worked with narcissists. Richard was deliberately making me sweat. He wanted me to sit in my empty house, panicking, refreshing my screen, completely consumed by my dependence on his supposed generosity. He was enjoying the power trip. Finally, at 3 in the afternoon, my phone chimed with a new email notification. It was not a text message. Richard had chosen to respond via email, a deliberate choice to maintain a cold corporate distance. I opened the application and read his words. The email was dripping with a toxic, patronizing condescension that practically leaped off the screen. Richard began by stating that business was business and that personal financial mismanagement on my part was not the responsibility of the Sterling family. However, he wrote, out of respect for my daughter and the new union between our families, he was willing to grant a temporary act of grace. Then came the exact sentences David and I had been praying for. Richard typed, as the sole managing member of Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC, I am officially authorizing a 30-day extension of your tenancy at the property. You must vacate the premises completely by the final day of the month. Understand that I maintain full ownership and domain over this asset, and any damage to the property during this grace period will result in immediate legal action against you. I let out a harsh, sharp breath that was half laugh and half sob. I did not waste a single second. I forwarded the entire email chain directly to David. Within 5 minutes, my phone rang. "We have them," David said, his voice thrumming with professional satisfaction. "Helen, this email is a goldmine. In civil and criminal property disputes, establishing the chain of control is everything." Richard just put into writing from his own personal email account that he is the managing director of the shell company, and that he is actively exercising authority over a fraudulently acquired asset across state lines. He just tied the noose around his own neck. Now we need to know exactly what he plans to do with your house before the 30 days are up. I told David I needed to think, and I ended the call. I walked through the quiet hallways of my home trying to figure out how to gain access to the Sterling's financial plans. I pushed open the door to the spare guest bedroom. The room was still cluttered with leftover wedding supplies, empty garment bags, and discarded ribbons. During the chaotic week leading up to the ceremony, Todd had used this room as a makeshift command center. He had been taking phone calls, coordinating with groomsmen, and supposedly managing vendor payments. My eyes landed on the small wooden desk in the corner of the room. Sitting perfectly centered on the desk was a sleek silver laptop computer. I walked over and stared at it. Todd had brought 2 laptops with him during the wedding week. He had taken his primary personal computer with him in his carry-on bag when he and Lily left for their flight to Bora Bora. He had explicitly told me he was leaving his secondary business laptop behind because he did not want to risk losing it on the islands. At the time, I had promised to keep it safe for him until they returned. I picked up the silver machine. It was heavy cold and locked behind a password screen. I remembered how Lily had laughed on the porch, how Todd had casually discussed demolishing my home. They felt so incredibly safe in their deception that they had left a loaded weapon sitting right inside my house. I pulled out my phone and drafted another message, this time to Todd. I kept the tone light, playing the role of the scatterbrained, accommodating mother-in-law. I wrote, "Hi Todd, just cleaning up the guest room, and I found your spare work laptop. Since your father is having me move out of the house soon, I boxed it up safely and put it in a secure commercial storage unit down the street. I will give you the locker key when you and Lily get back from your honeymoon. Have a wonderful time on the beach." I waited anxiously for his reply, hoping my casual lie would hold up. 20 minutes later, a text came through. Todd responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji and a brief message telling me that was fine and not to lose the storage key. He did not care. He was sitting on a tropical beach, completely confident that the foolish broken woman back in Seattle was dutifully packing away his belongings while preparing for her own homelessness. I wrapped the silver laptop in a thick wool sweater, placed it carefully into a canvas tote bag, and immediately called David. I told him what I had found. David did not miss a beat. He gave me an address for a discreet commercial office park in a neighboring suburb and told me to ask for a man named Brian. I drove through the heavy afternoon traffic, the canvas tote bag, sitting heavy on the passenger seat beside me. When I arrived at the address David provided, there were no large signs, just a plain glass door with a suite number. Inside the office looked like a server farm. Cables snaked along the baseboards, and a low hum of cooling fans filled the air. Brian was a quiet, intensely focused man in his late 40s who ran a private cybersecurity firm specializing in corporate espionage and high-stakes financial litigation. David trusted him completely. I placed the wrapped laptop on Brian's metal workbench. I felt a sudden sharp spike of anxiety. This was a massive escalation. I was no longer just gathering paper documents. I was actively breaching my son-in-law's digital privacy. A tiny conditioned voice in the back of my head whispered that good mothers do not do this. Good mothers do not spy on their children's spouses. but the memory of Lily's cold, mocking laughter silenced that voice instantly. Brian did not ask for a backstory. He simply booted up the machine, connected a series of external drives to the side ports, and began typing commands on a separate monitor. He told me it would take a few hours to bypass the administrative locks and clone the local hard drive. He advised me to go home and wait for his call. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. I paced my empty house, jumping at every shadow, terrified that Richard's private security men would suddenly return. I cleaned the kitchen counters until my knuckles ached. I desperately wanted the laptop to contain a smoking gun, but I was equally terrified of what I might find. What if they had already transferred the property to an offshore account? What if Lily was more deeply involved in the corporate fraud than I had originally suspected? At exactly 7 p.m, my cell phone rang. It was a conference call. David and Brian were both on the line. Helen, David said, and I could hear the absolute gravity in his voice. "I need you to sit down." I pulled out a wooden dining chair and sat heavily. "Did you get inside?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We got everything," Brian replied, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing over the speakerphone. Todd was incredibly careless. He left his local email client logged in, and his cloud storage folders were set to automatically sync to the desktop. I have successfully downloaded thousands of corporate communications, financial ledgers, and PDF documents related to Sterling Estate Holdings. "What did you find?" I demanded, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "We found the motive," David said slowly. "They are not just trying to flip your lot for a quick sale, Helen. They are using your home as a foundational asset to secure a massive amount of private capital." Brian took over the explanation. "I am looking at a series of emails between Richard Sterling and a private commercial lending firm out of Chicago. The Sterlings have applied for a $2 million commercial development loan. To secure a loan of that magnitude, they need substantial collateral. They have submitted a portfolio of properties to the lender, and your house is listed as their primary unencumbered asset." I shook my head, entirely confused. "But my house is only worth $450,000. How could they possibly use it to back a $2 million loan?" "Because they forged the property appraisal," David stated bluntly. "Todd used this laptop to digitally alter official real estate assessment documents. They manipulated the local zoning codes on paper, claiming that your residential street has already been rezoned for a multi-story commercial luxury complex. They submitted fake architectural renderings and falsified municipal approval stamps. They artificially inflated the value of your property on paper to over $1.8 million. The sheer audacity of the crime left me completely speechless. They had not just stolen my house. They were using my home to execute a multi-million-dollar bank heist." Helen listened to me very carefully. David continued, his voice tight with anticipation. "The digital paper trail Brian just uncovered proves that they have committed systemic wire fraud, document forgery, and severe federal bank fraud across state lines. The emails show that the Chicago lenders have tentatively approved the $2 million loan based on the fake appraisals. The only thing standing between the Sterlings and that cash is a final in-person presentation of the physical collateral documents to the lending executives." "When is the presentation?" I asked, feeling a cold electric focus wash away the last remnants of my fear. According to Todd's synced calendar, Brian said Richard and Beatrice are hosting an exclusive estate showcase and investor mixer at a luxury country club this coming Friday evening. The Chicago lending executives are flying in specifically for this event to finalize the funding. They are going to present your stolen deed to the bankers in a room full of people. They were going to use my house to secure their fraudulent fortune while drinking expensive champagne and accepting congratulations. They thought I was sitting at home weeping into cardboard boxes completely ignorant of the multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise they had built on my back. They believed they were absolutely untouchable. "We have the digital proof," David said, "but digital files can be contested in court by expensive defense lawyers. They can claim the laptop was hacked or the files were planted. If we want to guarantee federal prison sentences, we need them to physically hand those fraudulent documents to the investors. We need them to execute the final step of the wire fraud in real time. We need to catch them in the act." I looked around my quiet kitchen. I looked at the spot where Richard had arrogantly dropped the eviction notice. I thought about the decades I had spent managing payroll compliance, understanding the severe, unyielding consequences of financial fraud. I realized then that I possessed something much more dangerous than a good lawyer. I possessed the absolute element of surprise. "Contact the federal authorities." "David," I said, my voice ringing with a calm, terrifying certainty. "Tell them exactly where the Sterlings will be this Friday night. Let them set up their sting operation. But tell them to wait for my signal before they move in." "What are you planning?" Helen David asked. "I am going to that country club," I replied, standing up from the table. "I paid for my daughter's beautiful reception. I think it is only fair that I attend her father-in-law's spectacular launch party." Brian had uncovered the exact timeline of their grand illusion. David printed out the email threads and laid them across his massive mahogany desk like a deck of marked cards. I sat there in the quiet law office reading the words my daughter's new father-in-law had typed. Richard and Beatrice were not just quietly securing a bank loan behind closed doors. They were throwing a massive, opulent event to celebrate their theft. They called it an estate showcase and investor mixer. It was scheduled for this coming Friday night at the Oakmont Valley Country Club. That was the exact same luxury venue where I had just bankrupted myself to pay for Lily's wedding reception mere days ago. The sheer blinding arrogance of it made my pulse pound in my ears like a war drum. They had invited 50 high-net-worth investors from across the Pacific Northwest. The guest list included local real estate tycoons, private equity managers, and most importantly, the senior lending executives who were flying in directly from Chicago. And the centerpiece of their entire financial presentation was my house. Richard had created a glossy digital brochure to pass out at the mixer. Brian had managed to download the PDF file from Todd's cloud storage account. David turned his computer monitor toward me so I could see it clearly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Richard called my quiet, modest property a prime commercial redevelopment zone. He had literally hired someone to Photoshop a sleek, modern, multi-use condominium complex over the exact spot where I had planted blue hydrangeas for 2 decades. The digital rendering completely erased my home, replacing my life's work with glass balconies and retail storefronts. My home was their crown jewel asset. It was the absolute linchpin they needed to convince the Chicago executives to release the $2 million funding. I looked up from the bright screen, my hands resting flat and steady on the polished wood of the desk. The air in the office felt thick with anticipation. David was already pulling out his cell phone, his eyes locked on mine with a fierce, calculating intensity. "Civil court is a slap on the wrist for people like this," David told me, his voice carrying the sharp, practiced edge of a former federal prosecutor. "But when you cross state lines to defraud a bank, when you alter official tax records, when you forge municipal zoning approvals to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan, you invite the federal government directly into your living room." He did not waste another second. He made 2 phone calls right in front of me. One was to a senior contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a white-collar crime specialist he had worked alongside years ago. The second call was to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. David explained the situation using rapid, precise legal terminology. He mentioned wire fraud, interstate bank fraud, forged tax returns, and a documented pattern of racketeering involving multiple elderly victims over the past 10 years. He told them we had a cloned hard drive containing the digital blueprints of an active, ongoing multi-million-dollar heist. The response was immediate. The federal agents did not want to wait. They were not just mildly interested. They were hungry for a case with this much concrete digital evidence. The very next morning, I found myself walking through the heavy glass security doors of a federal building downtown. David walked beside me carrying a locked briefcase containing the flash drive Brian had prepared. We were escorted into a sterile, windowless conference room that smelled faintly of ozone and stale coffee. 2 federal agents were waiting for us at a long metal table. Agent Miller from the FBI was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely unreadable expression. Agent Davis from the IRS was a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she could dismantle a corporate ledger in her sleep. They did not offer me false sympathy. They did not look at me with the pitying, sorrowful glances I had received from bank tellers when I drained my retirement accounts. They treated me like a vital asset in a major criminal investigation, and for the first time since my daughter had broken my heart, I felt a surge of genuine, undeniable power. We laid the mountain of digital evidence on the table. Agent Miller reviewed the fraudulent property appraisals Todd had altered. Agent Davis scrutinized the falsified tax documents Richard had prepared to prove his shell company had millions in liquid assets to the Chicago lenders. They cross-referenced the names of the 3 other widows whose homes had been stolen using the exact same fake notary stamp provided by Todd's cousin. They confirmed exactly what David had suspected. The Sterlings were not just greedy socialites. They were running a highly sophisticated predatory criminal syndicate. But there was a catch. There is always a catch when it comes to securing an airtight federal indictment. Agent Miller leaned forward, clasping his hands firmly on the metal table. Having the forged documents on a cloned hard drive is incredibly strong evidence, Mrs. Gallagher, he explained, his voice low and steady. But defense attorneys for wealthy clients are slippery. If we raid their house right now, their lawyers will claim the files were just hypothetical drafts. They will say it was a business model that was never actually executed. They might even try to throw your son-in-law under the bus, claiming he created the fake documents without their knowledge. Agent Davis nodded in agreement, tapping her pen against the printed copy of the fake property deed. To nail Richard and Beatrice to the wall with absolute, undeniable certainty, we need the overt act. We need the execution of the crime to happen in real time. We need them to physically and formally present these fraudulent documents to the Chicago bank executives and the local investors. The exact moment they use those forged appraisals to solicit funds in a formal business setting, the wire fraud and racketeering charges become completely inescapable. They needed a sting operation. They needed to place undercover federal agents inside the country club mixer to witness the presentation firsthand and secure the physical copies of the fraudulent brochures. But there was a major logistical problem. The guest list for the estate showcase was incredibly tight. Richard had restricted entry to a carefully vetted list of 50 specific people. Beatrice was managing the door herself, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper to ensure no unwanted eyes ruined their perfect financial illusion. Agent Miller discussed the possibility of trying to infiltrate the country club catering staff, but David shook his head. He pointed out that Beatrice had used this specific venue for years and knew the management intimately. She would instantly recognize an unfamiliar waiter serving champagne in her private ballroom. If she suspected anything was out of place, Richard would abort the presentation, and the federal trap would collapse before it ever sprang shut. The room fell into a heavy, frustrated silence. The agents stared at the blueprints of the country club, trying to find a tactical weakness in Beatrice's security plan. I looked at the blueprints. I looked at the digital rendering of my demolished home. I thought about my daughter laughing on my front porch, mocking my unconditional love, while she helped criminals steal my sanctuary. The woman who would have stayed home and cried was completely gone. "I know how to get your agents inside the ballroom," I said. The three men and Agent Davis all turned to look at me, surprised by the absolute ringing certainty in my voice. I paid for my daughter's $75,000 wedding reception in that exact same ballroom. Just a few days ago, I explained, leaning forward and placing my finger on a specific hallway on the printed blueprint. I spent weeks arguing with the venue coordinator about access points. I know the layout of the grand ballroom better than Beatrice ever will. There is a secondary service corridor behind the main kitchen that connects directly to the private coat check room. The catering staff leaves that exterior loading door propped open for the ice deliveries around 7 o'clock every evening. You do not need to fake your way onto the guest list. You just need me to get you through the back door. Agent Miller raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed but cautious. "Mrs. Gallagher, we cannot ask a civilian to actively participate in a federal sting operation. It is a highly volatile situation. Richard and Beatrice will have their own private security team present. If they catch you slipping agents through the service corridor, they could become unpredictable. They expect me to be cowering in my kitchen." I replied, my voice hard and cold as ice. "They expect me to be paralyzed by my own maternal heartbreak, frantically packing my belongings into cardboard boxes while I wait for them to evict me. They believe I am a naive, pathetic woman who does not understand corporate finance. They will never look for me in the shadows of their own party." David looked at me, a silent, powerful understanding passing between us. He knew I was not doing this just to get my house back. I was doing this to reclaim my dignity. I did not want to sit at home while federal agents arrested the people who stole my life. I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to look Richard and Beatrice straight in the eye when their arrogant empire crumbled to dust. Agent Davis looked at Agent Miller, giving a slow, firm nod of approval. The plan was terrifying in its scope, but it was the only guaranteed way to secure the physical evidence of the fraud while the crime was actively in progress. We spent the next 4 hours detailing the exact logistics of the infiltration. I mapped out the timing of the country club service shifts based on my agonizing weeks of wedding preparation. I told them exactly when Beatrice would be distracted by greeting the Chicago executives at the main entrance, leaving the rear access points vulnerable. We synchronized our watches. We coordinated the handoff of the fraudulent manila folders. When I finally walked out of that federal building and stepped back onto the damp Seattle streets, the evening air felt crisp and clean. I was no longer a victim waiting for the executioner to arrive at my door. I had become the executioner. I was going to crash the most important night of their lives, and I was going to personally deliver the final nail in their coffin. The crisp Friday evening air swept the heavy gray clouds out of the Seattle sky, leaving behind a sharp and unforgiving twilight. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom and stared at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. The exhausted payroll manager who lived her life in sensible beige cardigans and practical flat shoes was completely gone. The desperate weeping mother who had collapsed on the living room floor, surrounded by flattened cardboard boxes, had been entirely erased. Tonight, I required armor. I had reached into the very back of my closet and pulled out a charcoal gray tailored power suit. I purchased it 5 years ago for a national corporate finance conference and never found the courage to wear it since. The fabric was heavy and structured. The lines were sharp, clean, and commanding. It fit me perfectly. I applied a bold layer of deep crimson lipstick that I usually reserved for rare holiday parties. I pinned my hair back tightly against my scalp with absolute precision. There was no softness left in my face. There was only a cold and magnificent resolve. I picked up my leather tote bag. It was heavy with the weight of 25 thick manila folders. I walked out of my quiet house, locked the heavy wooden front door, and climbed into my rattling 15-year-old sedan. The drive to the Oakmont Valley Country Club took exactly 35 minutes. With every mile that passed, my lingering anxiety melted away and was replaced by a powerful, surging adrenaline. This was the exact same route I had driven just last weekend for my daughter's wedding reception. Last week I had been a nervous and eager mother, praying that my modest background would not embarrass my beautiful child in front of her wealthy new in-laws. Tonight I was an executioner driving to a crime scene. I pulled my faded vehicle up to the grand entrance of the country club. The circular driveway was already packed with imported luxury cars and sleek black sedans. The young valet approached my window with a confused expression, clearly wondering if I had made a wrong turn. I handed him my keys with a perfectly steady hand, stepped out of the car, and smoothed the front of my charcoal jacket. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the towering mahogany doors. I could hear the elegant sweeping notes of a live string quartet floating through the evening air. The rich scent of roasted prime rib and expensive imported perfume hit me the moment I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The lobby was a magnificent display of wealth and privilege. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm and fractured golden light across the polished marble floors. 50 high-net-worth investors from across the Pacific Northwest mingled in small, sophisticated groups. They wore bespoke, tailored tuxedos and glittering designer evening gowns. I spotted Richard Sterling immediately. He was holding court near the massive mahogany bar. He held a glass of amber scotch in one hand and gestured broadly with the other, clearly entertaining a group of older men who looked like bank executives. Todd was standing a few feet away, laughing loudly, with 3 younger men in sharp suits. They were the Chicago lending executives David and the federal agents had warned me about. Todd was expertly playing the role of the brilliant young heir to a massive real estate empire. And then I saw Lily. My beautiful daughter was standing near a towering floral arrangement that I had paid for with my own retirement funds. She wore a stunning emerald green cocktail dress. She was smiling and nodding at an older woman, playing the perfect high society wife. A sharp, painful ache flared in my chest for just a fraction of a second before the cold ice of betrayal froze it solid. She knew exactly how they had paid for this lavish lifestyle. She had mocked my tears. She had laughed at my financial ruin. I took a deep breath and let the love I once had for her completely die. I took 2 steps deeper into the grand foyer. That was when Beatrice Sterling finally spotted me. Beatrice was wearing a breathtaking sapphire blue evening gown that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She was speaking to a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. She happened to glance toward the entrance, and her eyes locked onto my face. The polite, elegant smile she had been wearing completely vanished. Her face drained of all color. She dropped her hand to her side and stared at me as if a ghost had just walked through the front doors. She quickly looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed my arrival. When she realized the investors were still distracted by Richard and Todd, she marched directly toward me. She moved with the aggressive, purposeful stride of a predator defending her territory. She closed the distance between us in seconds. She reached out and tightly grabbed my elbow, attempting to forcibly steer me back toward the heavy wooden exit doors. "What are you doing here, Helen?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous and frantic whisper. "You are absolutely not on the guest list. This is a private corporate event. You need to leave this building immediately before you embarrass yourself and ruin my evening." I did not pull my arm away. I stood my ground like a concrete statue. I looked down at her perfectly manicured hand, clutching my gray sleeve, and then I looked directly into her panicked eyes. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I did not offer a single excuse. I leaned forward, bringing my face just inches away from her glittering diamond earrings. I lowered my voice to a calm and terrifying volume. "If you try to kick me out of this building right now," I whispered slowly, "I will scream at the top of my lungs to every single investor in this grand lobby. I will tell all these wealthy bankers from Chicago that you and your husband are actively evicting the mother of the bride just days after the wedding. I will tell them you forced me into bankruptcy. I will make a massive hysterical scene right here on this beautiful marble floor. Let me stay in the back of the room, or I will entirely ruin your precious reputation right this very second." Beatrice completely froze. Her fingers slowly uncurled from my jacket sleeve. She looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes frantically darted toward the group of Chicago banking executives standing near the bar. The entire Sterling Empire was built on the fragile illusion of endless wealth and impeccable social grace. The absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to them was a loud, messy public scandal involving a weeping, destitute mother. She knew that an ugly confrontation would instantly shatter the sophisticated atmosphere they had spent thousands of dollars trying to cultivate. She knew the investors would ask devastating questions. Beatrice swallowed hard, her chest heaving with suppressed rage and sheer panic. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. She leaned back slightly and pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the far side of the ballroom. "Go stand in the darkest corner near the catering service doors," Beatrice commanded, her voice shaking with absolute hatred. "Do not speak to anyone. Do not eat anything. Do not drink anything. You stay hidden in the shadows, and you keep your pathetic mouth completely shut. If you cause a single problem tonight, Helen, I promise you I will destroy whatever tiny, miserable fragment of a life you have left." I smiled at her. It was a cold and hollow expression that made her flinch backward. "Thank you, Beatrice," I replied softly. "I will be perfectly quiet." She turned around and practically ran back toward the bar to check on Richard. She smoothed her sapphire gown and pasted that fake glowing smile right back onto her face as she rejoined the wealthy crowd. The sheer arrogance of the woman was almost impressive. She genuinely believed she had successfully intimidated me. She thought she still held all the power. She had no idea that I was simply following the exact script David and the federal agents had written for me. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the grand foyer, keeping my back close to the expensive silk wallpaper. I moved toward the massive arched entrance of the main presentation ballroom. The room was set up beautifully. There were 10 round tables covered in crisp white linen. Crystal centerpieces towered over silver dinner plates. At the very front of the room stood a raised stage with a large projection screen and a wooden podium. This was where Richard intended to present his grand financial illusion. This was where he planned to project the forged digital renderings of my demolished home and secure the $2 million commercial development loan. I positioned myself exactly where Beatrice had ordered me to go. I stood in the deep shadows near the swinging wooden doors that led back into the massive industrial catering kitchen. This was the exact access point I had described to Agent Miller and Agent Davis at the federal building yesterday morning. Through the small round glass windows of the swinging doors, I could see the busy catering staff rushing back and forth. They were preparing the final hors d'oeuvres and loading up the large silver serving trays. I stood silently in the corner and simply watched the room fill with people. The wealthy investors began to drift from the lobby into the main ballroom, holding their drinks and laughing at polite jokes. Richard walked to the front of the room, shaking hands and clapping men on the shoulder. Todd and Lily followed closely behind him. Lily looked completely radiant and entirely carefree. She sat down at a reserved table near the front stage, chatting animatedly with the wife of a Chicago bank executive. Watching my own daughter charm the very people she was helping to defraud sent a fresh wave of cold disgust rushing through my veins. I looked down at the heavy leather tote bag resting against my leg. Inside were 25 thick manila folders. David and Brian, the cybersecurity expert, had worked late into the night compiling them. Each folder contained printed copies of the cloned emails proving the premeditated intent to commit fraud. Each folder held the original property assessment of my home placed directly next to the falsified commercial zoning documents Todd had created on his laptop. Each folder prominently featured the irrefutable evidence that the notary public who stamped my quitclaim deed was Todd's first cousin. The final page of every single folder was a typed summary explaining that Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC, was a fraudulent shell company actively under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal agents needed Richard to officially present his fake business brochures to the investors to lock in the criminal wire fraud and racketeering charges. But I wanted the investors to see the absolute truth before Richard even opened his mouth. I waited patiently in the dark corner. I watched the head catering coordinator step away from the service station to direct a waiter carrying a tray of empty glasses. The small staging table just inside the kitchen doors was left completely unattended for exactly 30 seconds. Sitting on that table were 5 large silver trays. Next to the trays sat a tall stack of glossy, beautiful business brochures that Richard had ordered the staff to distribute to the investor tables before his speech began. I moved with a silent and terrifying purpose. I slipped quietly through the swinging wooden doors and stepped into the chaotic kitchen. No one noticed the woman in the dark gray suit. I walked directly to the staging table. I opened my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out the 25 thick manila folders. I quickly and efficiently placed 5 manila folders onto every single silver serving tray, laying them directly on top of Richard's glossy fake brochures. I turned around and pushed back through the swinging doors, retreating into the deep shadows of the ballroom corner, just as the catering staff returned to the staging table. I stood completely still and watched as 5 different waiters picked up the silver trays. They walked out into the beautiful, brightly lit ballroom and began weaving through the tables of wealthy investors. I watched as they placed a thick, heavy manila folder at every single place setting. The trap was set, the bait was on the tables, and the execution was about to begin. The golden hour light, filtering through the large bay window, illuminated the dust motes dancing above my kitchen table. I sat completely still, staring at the fake quitclaim deed. Just hours ago, this single piece of paper had possessed the power to shatter my entire existence. Now backed by the irrefutable evidence safely copied to 3 secure cloud drives, it was nothing more than a pathetic prop in a deeply flawed play. I reached for my cell phone, ignoring the slight tremor in my fingers. David had been explicitly clear. The trap required the bait, and the bait had to look absolutely genuine. I needed to convince Richard Sterling that I was completely defeated. I took a steadying breath, summoning every ounce of the paralyzing fear I had genuinely felt earlier that morning. I pictured the cardboard boxes stacked in my garage, the daunting prospect of sleeping in my 15-year-old sedan, and the cold, mocking laughter of my daughter. I let that raw, terrifying vulnerability wash over me, guiding my fingers across the digital keyboard. I typed out a message to Richard that reeked of absolute desperation. I begged for mercy. I explained that after covering the remaining vendor invoices for the wedding, my accounts were entirely drained. I confessed that I had no immediate family to stay with, and that the wait lists for affordable senior housing were months long. I pleaded with him completely, casting aside my own pride for a 30-day extension to remain in my home. I told him I needed the time to sell my remaining furniture and find a cheap studio apartment. I concluded the message by acknowledging his absolute power over my living situation, validating his inflated sense of control. I hit send and immediately set the phone face down on the wooden table. The silence in the kitchen felt heavier now. The waiting was a different kind of torture. 30 agonizing minutes crept by before the sharp ping of an incoming email shattered the quiet. Richard had not replied via text message. He had chosen the formal, detached medium of email to deliver his response. I quickly opened the notification, my eyes scanning the block of text. The message was a masterpiece of corporate arrogance. Richard began by stating that the Sterling family was not running a charity organization, and that poor financial planning on my part was not their burden to bear. However, he continued, considering the recent union of our children, he was willing to demonstrate exceptional leniency. Then came the exact sentences David and I needed. Richard wrote, "As the sole managing director of Sterling Estate Holdings, LLC, I am officially granting you a strict 30-day extension to vacate the premises. You will surrender all keys and completely abandon the property by the 1st of next month. Understand that I maintain total legal control over this asset, and any damage done to the property during this grace period will result in immediate financial litigation." A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my lips. I forwarded the entire email chain directly to David. It was the perfect, undeniable written proof that Richard Sterling was actively and knowingly exercising control over the fraudulently acquired property. The bait had been taken. Now I needed to secure the rest of the puzzle. I stood up from the table and walked down the hallway to the guest bedroom. The room still smelled faintly of the expensive floral perfume Lily had worn on her wedding day. The space was littered with the remnants of the chaotic week leading up to the ceremony. Discarded ribbon, empty dress bags, and half-empty water bottles covered the dresser. In the corner of the room, sitting perfectly square on the small writing desk, was Todd's secondary laptop. He had brought it with him to manage last-minute vendor contracts and seating charts. Before leaving for their tropical honeymoon, Todd had explicitly mentioned leaving this specific computer behind, stating he did not want to risk sand or water damage on the islands. He had casually asked me to keep it safe until they returned. I picked up the sleek silver machine. It felt heavy in my hands, a silent vault containing the secrets of their criminal enterprise. I pulled out my phone and drafted a quick text message to Todd. I kept the tone light, playing the role of the organized, helpful mother-in-law. "Hi, Todd," I wrote. "I am starting to pack up my things since Richard is having me move out soon. I found your work laptop in the guest room. I went ahead and boxed it up safely and put it in my storage unit down the street so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. I will give you the locker key as soon as you get back. Enjoy Bora Bora." I held my breath, waiting. A few minutes later, a reply popped up. It was a simple thumbs-up emoji followed by a brief message thanking me for handling it and telling me not to lose the key. He was sitting on a beach thousands of miles away, utterly unconcerned. He genuinely believed his digital secrets were safely locked away in a cardboard box by a broken woman preparing for homelessness. I wrapped the laptop in a thick wool blanket, placed it carefully into a sturdy canvas tote bag, and immediately called David to confirm the drop-off. He gave me an address for a private commercial building in a neighboring suburb and told me to ask for a specialist named Brian. The drive took 40 minutes. The building was an unassuming gray concrete structure, completely devoid of any corporate signage. Inside, the suite looked more like a server room than a traditional office. Heavy black cables snaked across the floor, and the low, constant hum of massive cooling fans filled the air. Brian was a quiet, intensely focused man who barely offered a greeting. He took the canvas bag from my hands, removed the laptop, and set it on a metal workbench. He connected a series of thick cables to the side ports and began typing rapidly on a separate glowing monitor. He told me the extraction and cloning process would take several hours and that David would contact me when it was finished. I returned to my empty house and paced the living room floor until the sun completely vanished beneath the horizon. At 8 o'clock that evening, my phone finally rang. It was a conference call with David and Brian. Helen David said, his voice stripped of its usual smooth, professional cadence. The tone was sharp and entirely serious. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brian took over the explanation. Todd's digital security was practically non-existent. He left his local email client fully logged in, and his cloud storage directories were set to automatically sync to the desktop. I have successfully bypassed the administrative locks and pulled a complete unencrypted clone of the hard drive. We found the entire operational blueprint for Sterling Estate Holdings. "They are not just flipping your property for a quick residential sale," Helen David interjected, his voice heavy with anticipation. "They are using the stolen equity of your home as the foundational collateral to secure a massive commercial development loan." Brian continued detailing the evidence. "I have a continuous chain of emails between Richard Sterling and a private commercial lending firm located in Chicago. The Sterlings have formally applied for a $2 million funding package. To secure a loan of that magnitude, they need substantial high-value collateral. They have submitted a portfolio of assets to the lender, and your house is listed as the primary unencumbered property backing the entire loan." I shook my head, staring blankly at the wall. "That does not make any sense," I said slowly. "My house is in a modest suburban neighborhood. It is only valued at $450,000. How could they possibly use it to back a $2 million commercial loan?" "Because they forged the property appraisal," David stated bluntly. "Todd used this exact laptop to digitally manipulate official county real estate assessment documents. He altered the local municipal zoning codes on paper, falsely claiming that your residential street has already been rezoned for a multi-story luxury commercial complex. They submitted fake architectural renderings and completely falsified city approval stamps to the lenders. They artificially inflated the value of your property on paper to over $1.8 million. The sheer breathtaking scale of the crime left me entirely speechless. They had not just stolen my family home. They were using my sanctuary to execute a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar federal bank fraud. The digital paper trail Brian just uncovered proves systemic wire fraud, document forgery, and a clear pattern of racketeering." David continued, his voice picking up speed. "The emails clearly indicate that the Chicago lenders have tentatively approved the $2 million loan based entirely on those fake appraisals. The only thing standing between the Sterlings and a massive payout is a final in-person presentation of the physical collateral documents to the lending executives." "When is the final presentation?" I asked, the cold numbness completely fading, replaced by a sharp, burning focus. "According to the synced calendar on Todd's machine," Brian replied. "Richard and Beatrice are hosting an exclusive estate showcase and investor mixer at the Oakmont Valley Country Club this coming Friday evening. The Chicago lending executives are flying in specifically for this event to finalize the funding details. They are going to formally present your stolen forged deed to the bankers in a room full of high net worth investors. They were going to use my home to secure a fraudulent fortune while sipping expensive champagne and accepting the polite applause of high society. They believed they were absolutely entirely untouchable. We have the digital proof," David said, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. "But digital files can be endlessly contested in court by expensive defense teams. They can claim the laptop was compromised or that the files were planted by a malicious third party. If we want to guarantee federal prison sentences, we need the overt act. We need them to physically hand those fraudulent documents to the investors. We need to catch them in the very act of executing the fraud." I looked around my quiet kitchen. I looked at the exact spot where Richard had arrogantly dropped the eviction notice. I thought about the decades I had spent meticulously managing payroll compliance, understanding the severe, unyielding consequences of financial fraud. I realized then that I possessed something much more dangerous than a good lawyer. I possessed the absolute element of surprise. "Contact the federal authorities, David," I said, my voice ringing with a calm, terrifying certainty. "Tell them exactly where the Sterlings will be this Friday night. Let them set up their sting operation. But tell them to wait for my signal before they move in." "What are you planning?" Helen David asked, a note of genuine caution in his voice. "I am going to that country club," I replied, standing up straight. "I paid for my daughter's lavish reception in that exact same building. I think it is only fair that I attend her new family's spectacular launch party." The echo of my voice hung in the cavernous ballroom like thick smoke after a fire. I had just instructed the wealthiest people in the city to open the folders I had secretly delivered to their tables. The initial reaction was a suffocating, absolute silence. 50 high-net-worth individuals, the absolute elite of the Pacific Northwest, stared down at the forensic audit papers, the proof of the forged notary stamp, and the printed transcripts of my daughter plotting my financial ruin. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes completely ceased. The live string quartet in the corner stopped playing mid-measure. The grand illusion of the Sterling family empire was disintegrating under the bright chandelier lights. Richard Sterling was the first to break the paralysis. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. He lunged toward the edge of the stage, his polished corporate facade completely dissolving into raw, ugly panic. He pointed a violently shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a psychotic, jealous woman. He shouted to the horrified crowd that I was a disgruntled former-in-law having a mental breakdown because I could not afford to maintain my end of a family arrangement. He desperately demanded that the country club security forcefully and immediately remove me from the premises. Beatrice Sterling was clutching the fabric of her sapphire evening gown, her chest heaving as she tried to compose herself. She frantically signaled to a passing waiter to call the police, entirely unaware that the authorities were already waiting just outside the property line. Lily stood frozen near the front table. Her stunning emerald green designer dress, funded entirely by my drained retirement accounts, suddenly looked incredibly foolish against the backdrop of a massive financial crime. She turned toward me, her face pale and contorted with furious indignation. She screamed at me to stop humiliating her. She yelled that I was ruining the most important night of her life and embarrassing her in front of her high society friends. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground in my charcoal gray power suit. I looked at my daughter and smiled with a cold, hollow expression. I told her clearly that I was not humiliating her. I told her I was simply introducing her wealthy new investors to her federal auditors. Just as Richard opened his mouth to scream for security again, the heavy double mahogany doors at the main entrance of the banquet hall did not just open. They were shoved apart with a kinetic, violent force that made the thick wood crash loudly against the interior walls. It was not the country club security team responding to Richard's frantic demands. It was a solid wall of men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow letters printed across their broad backs. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Agent Miller strode into the center of the grand ballroom. His presence immediately sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the space. Agent Davis flanked him, her sharp eyes scanning the room, until she locked onto the glossy brochures and my manila folders resting on the investor tables. The wealthy elites scrambled backward, knocking over expensive floral arrangements and spilling dark red wine across the crisp white linens. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal raid. They dropped the investment packets like they were holding live explosives and backed away toward the perimeter of the room. Agent Miller unclipped a heavy radio from his tactical belt and gave a short, sharp command. A dozen armed federal agents immediately fanned out across the room, securing every single exit and blocking the service corridors. Richard Sterling desperately tried to maintain his arrogant, untouchable corporate facade. He stepped down from the raised stage, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, and told Agent Miller that this was a massive misunderstanding. He claimed it was a private corporate function and demanded to see a search warrant. He threatened to call his aggressive team of defense lawyers and sue the federal government for trespassing. Agent Davis stepped forward, completely ignoring his empty threats. She walked to the nearest investor table and picked up one of the manila folders I had meticulously prepared. She held up the forged property appraisal and the fake commercial zoning documents for my home. She announced in a clear, ringing voice that echoed off the high ceiling that Richard Sterling, Beatrice Sterling, and Todd Sterling were officially under arrest. She stated the charges clearly so every single wealthy investor in the room could hear them. Systemic wire fraud, interstate bank fraud, operating a criminal racketeering enterprise. She explained that by formally presenting these fabricated financial documents to out-of-state investors in an attempt to secure a $2 million commercial loan, they had crossed the threshold from a local civil dispute into a major federal crime. The trap David and I had set had been sprung flawlessly. The overt act of fraud had been committed and witnessed by 50 people. The confident, untouchable posture of the Sterling family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed terribly in the large room. She collapsed against a linen-covered table, sobbing wildly and screaming that she did not know anything about any fraudulent deeds or fake notary stamps. She claimed her husband handled all the paperwork and begged the agents not to touch her. All of her refined high society elegance evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic criminal. Richard completely lost all his refined composure. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He began shouting obscenities, physically struggling against two large federal agents who swiftly and professionally pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the chaos of the room. They pushed him face first against the polished wooden podium he had just been standing behind, stripping him of every ounce of his unearned dignity. But it was Todd who proved to be the ultimate absolute coward. The polished, handsome heir to a fake real estate empire instantly turned on his own blood the moment he realized he was going to prison. As a federal agent pushed him against a marble pillar to secure his wrists, Todd began hyperventilating. He wept loudly, tears streaming down his face, begging the agents to listen to him. He screamed that his father had made him do it. He shouted that Richard had forced him to alter the digital appraisals on the laptop and that he was just following orders to save the family from their mounting debts. He threw away every single ounce of familial loyalty to save his own skin, revealing exactly what kind of man my daughter had chosen to marry. Amidst the screaming, the crying, and the flashing red and blue lights that were now illuminating the country club windows from the parking lot, my daughter stood entirely paralyzed. Lily watched in absolute unblinking horror as the men she had chosen over her own mother were stripped of their wealth, their status, and their freedom. Her perfect high society dream was violently disintegrating in real time. The glamorous, wealthy future she had actively plotted to steal my home for was gone forever. She watched the federal agents drag her sobbing, pathetic new husband toward the exit doors. She watched her arrogant father-in-law being shoved forward in handcuffs. She watched the wealthy investors looking at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Slowly, Lily turned her head and looked directly at me. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine across the crowded, chaotic ballroom. For 26 years, whenever she was in trouble, whenever she had made a terrible mistake, whenever she needed someone to fix her problems, She had looked at me exactly like that. She had always expected her devoted, foolish, sacrificing mother to rush forward, take the blame, open her wallet, and save her from the consequences of her own actions. She looked at me now, standing in the middle of her ruined life, and I saw her mouth tremble as she formed the word "Mom." I saw her take a tentative, shaking step in my direction. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted me to embrace her, tell her everything would be okay, and rescue her from the wreckage of the nightmare she had actively helped create. I looked back at the girl I had given my entire youth to raise. I looked at the child I had eaten cheap noodles for so she could have a beautiful graduation dress. And as I stared at her terrified, pleading face, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, unconditional reservoir of maternal love I had carried for her my entire life had been completely and permanently drained the very moment she laughed about my impending homelessness on that security camera footage. The woman who would have sacrificed her own life to save her daughter was dead. Only the survivor remained. I looked at her with eyes made of solid ice. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I did not shed a single tear for her broken heart. I did not take a step forward to catch her as she began to sob. I simply turned on my heel, presenting my back to her shattered world, and walked smoothly and confidently toward the side exit of the ballroom. The cool, crisp night air hit my face as I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the country club. The massive circular driveway was completely filled with federal vehicles and local police cruisers. I walked past the flashing lights and the gathering crowd of country club staff, my posture perfectly straight and my stride completely steady. I found my rattling 15-year-old sedan parked in the far back lot. I unlocked the heavy door, sat down in the familiar driver's seat, and placed my hands firmly on the worn steering wheel. I was 54 years old. I had been deeply betrayed, violently manipulated, and very nearly destroyed by the people who were supposed to be my family. I had been treated like an invisible bank account and a disposable nuisance, but they had completely failed to break me. I started the engine. The sound was loud and rough, lacking the smooth purr of a luxury vehicle. But to my ears, it sounded like pure, unadulterated freedom. I knew exactly what would happen next. The fraudulent quitclaim deed would be easily invalidated by David in civil court, now that the federal government had officially seized the Sterling's assets and indicted them for systemic bank fraud. I was going to keep my modest house. I was going to keep my blue hydrangeas in the front yard. I was going to keep the quiet, peaceful life I had worked so incredibly hard to build over decades of honest labor. The arrogant people who tried to bury me were going to spend the next 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Lily would be left with nothing but a ruined reputation, a mountain of legal bills, and the cold realization that she had thrown away the only person who had ever truly loved her. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. I drove away from the flashing lights, leaving the dark, toxic past entirely behind me. The road ahead was quiet and empty, and for the first time in a very long time I felt genuinely excited about the future. I learned the hardest lesson a person can possibly learn in this life. Love is not a currency you can buy with blind, endless sacrifice. And family is not simply defined by shared blood when that blood turns out to be entirely toxic. Boundaries are not a betrayal of love. They are the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. You have the absolute right to walk away from anyone who uses your devotion as a weapon against you. You deserve to be treated with basic respect, fundamental dignity, and genuine kindness, even by your own children. No amount of guilt or manipulation should ever convince you to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. I know how difficult it can be to confront the painful reality of family betrayal. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to find your own strength and fight back against the people who took your love for granted, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Your support helps bring these important stories to light and reminds us all that we are never truly alone. Until next time, remember that you are always strong enough to save yourself. 90 days is a remarkably short period of time to completely rebuild a shattered life. 3 months ago, I was a desperate woman collapsing on the hardwood floor of my living room. I was surrounded by flattened cardboard boxes and entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of sleeping in the back seat of my 15-year-old sedan. Today, the morning sun poured through the large glass bay window of my kitchen, warming the polished floorboards and illuminating the quiet sanctuary that was now legally, completely, and undeniably mine. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had taken up permanent residence in my chest since the morning of my daughter's wedding rehearsal had completely evaporated. I am Helen Gallagher, a 54-year-old payroll manager, and I had successfully navigated through the darkest storm of my existence to find a profound, unshakable peace on the exact same property they tried to steal from me. The federal justice system is often described as an incredibly slow-moving machine, but when it is handed a pristine, cloned hard drive containing over a decade of sophisticated wire fraud, it strikes with the devastating and immediate force of a runaway freight train. The entire Sterling Empire had unraveled with a breathtaking and highly public speed. My brilliant attorney David kept me meticulously updated on every single development of the criminal case. Richard and Beatrice Sterling were currently sitting in separate federal holding facilities, entirely stripped of their expensive designer wardrobes and their arrogant country club sneers. They had been officially denied bail after federal prosecutors uncovered their frantic, last-minute attempts to wire millions of stolen dollars to hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The local Seattle newspapers and the evening news broadcasts had an absolute field day with the scandal. It was the exact kind of spectacular high society downfall that ordinary people simply could not look away from. The investigative media exposed the stark, ugly truth that the glamorous couple from the Oakmont Valley Country Club had never possessed a single dime of legitimate generational wealth. They were nothing more than highly organized serial predators hiding behind expensive, tailored suits and leased luxury vehicles. For over 10 years, they had operated Sterling Estate Holdings not as a legitimate commercial property management firm, but as a highly coordinated criminal racketeering enterprise. They preyed on vulnerable senior citizens. They groomed them, manipulated them, and systematically stole their home equity through forged legal documents and blatant psychological intimidation. The federal prosecutors aggressively piled on the indictments. Richard and Beatrice were facing dozens of severe charges for systemic wire fraud, interstate bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive tax evasion. Legal experts publicly speculated on the television news that they would spend the next 2 to 3 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Beatrice had reportedly spent her first 48 hours in custody, throwing spectacular temper tantrums and demanding to speak to a facility manager. She was completely unable to comprehend that her haughty attitude and her demands for sparkling water held absolutely zero power over the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Todd, the handsome and charismatic groom, had desperately tried to save his own skin the very moment the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists in the middle of that banquet hall. He had immediately requested a proffer session offering to testify against his own parents in exchange for a lighter prison sentence. He wept openly in the stark interrogation room, portraying himself as a misguided young pawn, acting under the strict, terrifying orders of his domineering father. But the digital forensics, extracted from his own backup laptop, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the primary architect of the forged real estate appraisals and the altered municipal zoning documents. His cousin Marcus Vance, the fake notary public who had illegally stamped my fraudulent quitclaim deed, had also been swept up in the coordinated federal raid. The presiding federal judge showed absolutely no sympathy for any of them. My personal legal victory had arrived in a thick, heavy manila envelope from David just 2 weeks prior. A federal judge had officially and permanently voided the fraudulent quitclaim deed. My modest suburban house was legally returned to me free and clear of any encumbrances. The deed was once again registered solely under my name. But David and the aggressive federal prosecutors had not stopped at simply returning my property. They collaborated closely with the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division to aggressively track down the money the Sterlings had stolen and hoarded. The court seized their hidden investment accounts, liquidated their leased luxury assets, and froze every single financial resource tied to their names to pay mandatory victim restitution. Not only was my home completely secure, but the court ordered a full and immediate reimbursement of the $75,000 I had drained from my life savings to pay for that lavish wedding reception. The stolen money was wired directly back into my retirement account, replenishing the financial future I thought I had lost forever. The profound relief of logging into my bank portal and seeing those numbers restored to their rightful place was a feeling I will cherish for the rest of my days. I had walked into David's law office as a destitute, terrified woman bracing for total financial ruin and a life of poverty. I walked out of the entire ordeal completely whole and entirely untouchable. There was, however, one final loose end that the federal courts could not tie up for me. That was a deeply personal knot I had to sever entirely by myself. It happened on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. The late autumn leaves were just beginning to turn bright, beautiful shades of orange and gold, falling gently onto my meticulously kept front lawn. I was sitting in my living room, comfortably reading a paperback novel on the very same sofa where I had once hyperventilated in pure terror. The sudden sharp ringing of the front doorbell shattered the quiet afternoon silence. I set my book down on the wooden coffee table, walked slowly into the tiled foyer, and looked through the small glass peephole. Standing on my welcome mat was Lily. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the wooden door open. The stark physical contrast between the woman standing on my porch and the radiant, arrogant bride from 3 months ago was incredibly jarring. Lily looked entirely ruined. Her perfectly styled blonde waves were limp, stringy, and tied back in a messy, uneven knot. She was wearing a faded, oversized gray sweatshirt and a pair of wrinkled, dark sweatpants. At her feet sat a cheap, scuffed plastic suitcase that looked like it had been dragged through miles of dirty gravel. The expensive designer silk robes, the immaculate manicures, the haughty high society sneer, all of it had been completely and violently stripped away. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had gambled her soul for unearned wealth and lost absolutely everything. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, puffy, and rimmed with angry red lines. The very moment she saw my face, she immediately launched into a theatrical, trembling performance that felt entirely rehearsed and deeply insincere. "Mom," she sobbed loudly, her voice breaking dramatically as she reached out a shaking hand to grab the edge of the white wooden doorframe. "Please, you have to let me in. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I did not step aside. I stood perfectly still, blocking the entrance to my warm, safe sanctuary. I looked at her with a calm, analytical detachment. I searched my heart for a single drop of maternal warmth. I waited to feel the desperate biological urge to pull her into my arms, to wipe away her tears, to sacrifice my own comfort, to solve her massive problems. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, unconditional reservoir of love I had carried for her that my entire life was completely bone dry. I just stood there and observed her acting like I was watching a poorly written television drama. The federal prosecutors froze all of Todd's bank accounts. Lily cried, her chest heaving, as she tried to force a steady stream of tears down her pale cheeks. The luxury downtown apartment is gone. The bank took everything. His parents are going to federal prison forever, and Todd is facing 20 years behind bars. My lawyers are telling me the annulment might take months to finalize because of the ongoing criminal investigation tying up all the marital assets. I have $0 to my name. All of my friends from the country club have blocked my phone number. They treat me like I have a contagious disease. Mom, it has been an absolute living nightmare. She paused, wiping her nose with the back of her dirty gray sleeve, waiting for my reaction. When I simply continued to stare at her with an unwavering blank expression, she amplified her performance. She took a tentative step closer, clasping her hands together in front of her chest, like a begging, frightened child. I did not know what they were doing, Mom, she pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. I swear to you I had no idea Todd was a criminal. He manipulated me. He lied to me just like he lied to you. I was completely blind to it. You have to believe me. I am a victim too. Please just let me move back into my old childhood bedroom. I just need a place to stay while I figure out my life. I just need to come home. I looked down at the scuffed plastic suitcase resting on my welcome mat. I looked at the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. Then I thought about the high-definition security camera footage I had watched sitting alone in this very house. I thought about the clear, crisp audio of my daughter standing on this exact same porch, laughing maliciously with her criminal fiancé about my imminent financial destruction. I remembered the cold, mocking tone in her voice as she called my unconditional maternal love pathetic. She had known about the fake notary public. She had known about the commercial flipping scheme. She had gleefully anticipated my eviction while actively plotting to use my stolen home equity to fund her endless luxury lifestyle. You are not a victim, Lily, I said softly. My voice was completely even, lacking any trace of anger, sorrow, or volume. It was the voice of a total stranger. Lily stopped crying for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic and profound confusion crossed her face before she quickly resumed her frantic weeping. What are you talking about? She whimpered, wiping at her eyes. Mom, I am your daughter. I need you to help me. You watched them steal my home, and you laughed, I said quietly, the undeniable, ugly truth hanging heavily and sharply in the crisp autumn air. You knew exactly what Todd was doing with that heavy wooden clipboard on the morning of your rehearsal. You joked about his cousin providing the fake notary stamp. You explicitly stated that I was so desperate for your approval that I would sign away my entire soul. You stood right here on this porch and happily discussed flipping my property for $1 million, while you knew perfectly well I was inside draining my retirement accounts to buy your expensive catered sea bass and your imported wedding flowers. Lily completely froze. The fake theatrical tears instantly stopped falling. Her mouth fell open, but her voice entirely failed her. The terrifying realization that I had seen the hidden footage, that I knew the absolute unforgivable depths of her betrayal, washed over her like a tidal wave of freezing water. The pathetic weeping facade melted away completely, revealing the terrified, cornered, selfish woman underneath. She realized in that exact moment that her ultimate safety net had been completely destroyed by her own greedy hands. Mom, I can explain. She stammered frantically, taking a clumsy step backward. It was not like that. Todd told me to say those things. I was just going along with it because I was scared of him. You have to understand, I was just trying to survive in his world. I did not let her finish the pathetic sentence. I had spent 26 years listening to her endless excuses, taking the heavy blame for her massive mistakes and sacrificing my own peace to pave her way. That era of my existence was permanently closed. "You are not my daughter anymore," I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as solid granite. "You are an accomplice. Figure it out yourself." Lily gasped, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. "You cannot do this," she cried out, dropping the helpless act entirely and resorting to genuine frantic anger. "You cannot just leave me out here on the porch. I am your flesh and blood. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to survive without any money?" I took a deliberate step backward into the warmth of my foyer. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut. I did not slam it in a fit of rage. I closed it with a firm, quiet, and absolute finality. I turned the brass deadbolt, the loud, solid click echoing perfectly in the entryway. Through the thick wood, I could hear Lily pounding her fists desperately against the door. I could hear her screaming my name, begging me to open up, sobbing that she was sorry and that she had made a terrible mistake. I did not hesitate. I did not look back through the glass peephole to check on her. I simply turned around and walked back into my peaceful, sunlit living room. I picked up my novel, sat down on the comfortable sofa, and easily found my page. The frantic pounding eventually slowed and then stopped entirely. The dramatic sobbing faded away as she dragged her cheap suitcase down the concrete driveway. And then there was nothing but the quiet, peaceful, and magnificent sound of my own home. I lost a toxic, ungrateful daughter, but I gained my absolute freedom. I learned that love without mutual respect is merely financial exploitation, and that setting a firm, permanent boundary is not a betrayal of family, but the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. I sit in my home today completely safe, financially secure, and perfectly content. The monsters who tried to bury me are locked away in concrete cells, and the child who handed them the shovel is entirely out of my life. I am the master of my own peace, and I will never let anyone take it from me again. If you are watching this video, and you have ever been treated like a disposable resource by the people who are supposed to love you, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You do not owe your life to anyone who treats your sacrifices like an entitlement. You have the absolute right to lock your door against those who bring chaos into your sanctuary. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and survival. Leave a comment below telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Your engagement helps this channel grow, and it helps these important stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. Until next time, remember to always fiercely protect your peace. The morning sun crested over the tall oak trees lining the edge of my backyard, casting long, golden shadows across the frost-covered grass. I sat comfortably in my favorite wicker chair on the back porch, with both of my hands wrapped tightly around a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The crisp morning air carried the faint, earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. It was the kind of perfectly still autumn morning that felt entirely suspended in time. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional distant hum of a passing car or the soft chirping of a cardinal resting in the branches above. I took a slow, deep breath and let the steam from my coffee warm my face. I looked out over my perfectly manicured garden. My beloved blue hydrangeas were currently dormant, resting quietly beneath a fresh layer of protective winter mulch. Just a few short months ago, those exact same flower beds were featured in a fraudulent, glossy brochure erased by digital software and replaced by a cold, sterile commercial parking garage. Today, they were safe. The soil was undisturbed. The property lines were secure. Every single brick, every wooden floorboard, every pane of glass in this house belonged entirely, undeniably, and legally to me. There is a very specific, profound type of silence that settles into a home after a massive storm has finally passed. It is not an empty or lonely silence. It is a rich, heavy, and deeply comforting tranquility. For the first time in 26 years, I was not waiting for my cell phone to ring with an urgent demand. I was not mentally calculating my monthly payroll budget to figure out how I could afford another ungrateful request. I was not shrinking my own existence down to a manageable size so that someone else could take up all the room in my life. I was simply existing in a sanctuary that I had fought a brutal war to protect. My finances were completely secure. The federal court had done its job with absolute precision. The restitution payments had completely replenished my retirement accounts. The money I had foolishly drained to pay for a lavish country club wedding reception had been seized from the hidden offshore accounts of the Sterling family and wired directly back into my bank. When I log into my financial portals now, I do not feel that familiar icy grip of panic tightening around my throat. I do not see a fragile tightrope of debt. I see a solid concrete foundation that guarantees my independence for the rest of my natural life. I took another sip of my coffee and leaned back against the comfortable cushions of the porch chair. The physical relief of being safe had finally begun to seep into my bones. The constant tension that used to live in my shoulders and my jaw had completely melted away. I was no longer a victim waiting in the shadows for the next disaster to strike. I was no longer the pathetic, desperate woman weeping on a hardwood floor surrounded by packing boxes. The woman who had allowed herself to be treated as a disposable stepping stone was entirely gone. I spent a very long time reflecting on the psychological machinery that had kept me trapped in that toxic dynamic for so many years. It is incredibly difficult to untangle the twisted threads of maternal duty from the harsh reality of emotional exploitation. Society teaches women, especially mothers of my generation, a very dangerous and insidious lie. We are constantly told that our ultimate value is directly measured by our capacity to endure suffering for the sake of our children. We are conditioned to believe that a good mother is an empty vessel endlessly pouring out her own resources, her own joy and her own security until there is absolutely nothing left. I had completely internalized that destructive script. I had built my entire identity around being the reliable, sacrificing mother who could always be counted on to fix every single problem. When Lily was young, I worked extra shifts at the payroll office just to buy her the brand name clothes she demanded so she would not feel left out. When she went to college, I delayed my own dental work to pay for her expensive sorority fees. I constantly smoothed over her mistakes. I constantly apologized for her cruel remarks. I rationalized her horrific behavior by telling myself that she was just finding her way in the world and that my unconditional support would eventually soften her heart. But I had not been supporting her. I had been buying her affection. I had been paying an exorbitant emotional and financial ransom simply to avoid the terrifying pain of her rejection. I was so deeply afraid of losing my daughter that I willingly handed over the keys to my own survival. I convinced myself that if I just gave her one more thing, if I just made one more massive sacrifice, she would finally look at me with genuine love and gratitude. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a human being can ever learn. For 26 years, I believed that being a good mother meant endless sacrifice. But I learned the hard way that when you set yourself on fire to keep people warm, they will only complain about the ashes. They will never thank you for the flames. They will never acknowledge the agony of your burning skin. They will simply warm their hands by the fire you created from your own destruction, and then they will complain that the smoke is getting in their eyes. Lily and the Sterling family did not care that I was burning alive. They only cared about how much heat they could extract from my life before I was completely reduced to dust. They viewed my maternal devotion not as a beautiful virtue, but as a glaring, pathetic vulnerability that they could easily exploit for commercial real estate profit. The realization of that truth was a brutal and agonizing process. It felt like walking through a landscape of broken glass. But once I finally accepted the reality of who my daughter truly was, the illusion completely shattered. I stopped making excuses for her cruelty. I stopped trying to translate her greed into a language of misunderstood youth. She was a grown woman who had actively participated in a calculated criminal conspiracy to render her own mother homeless. There was no excuse. There was no justification. There was only the cold, hard reality of her choices. The moment I stopped shrinking myself to fit into their manipulative narrative was the exact moment I reclaimed my entire life. When you stop accepting less than you deserve, the people who benefit from your low self-esteem will inevitably call you selfish. They will call you cruel. They will stand on your front porch with a scuffed plastic suitcase and cry theatrical tears, demanding that you return to your designated role as their permanent safety net. But the deadbolt on my front door is a physical manifestation of the new boundary I have drawn around my soul. A boundary is not a weapon of revenge. It is an instrument of peace. Locking that door against my own daughter was the most difficult thing I have ever done, but it was also the most necessary. I could not save her from the consequences of her actions without drowning myself in the process. She chose her path. She chose her high society criminals. She chose to mock my tears and plot my financial ruin. Now she has to navigate the wreckage of her own terrible decisions without using my life raft. I look around my beautiful, quiet garden, and I realize that the space I cleared by removing toxic people has been filled with an incredible sense of possibility. I am 54 years old, and my story is not ending. It is completely restarting. I have decades ahead of me to travel, to read, to cultivate my garden, and to discover who Helen Gallagher actually is when she is not completely consumed by the demands of an ungrateful child. I have the time and the resources to invest entirely in my own happiness. The air grew slightly cooler as a gentle morning breeze swept across the porch. I finished the last drops of my coffee and rested the warm ceramic mug on my lap. I felt a profound connection to every single person out there who has ever felt the crushing weight of a one-sided relationship. I know exactly what it feels like to sit in the dark and wonder why your absolute best is never considered good enough. I know the unique agonizing pain of realizing that the family members you would gladly die for would not even cross the street to help you. I want to speak directly to you right now. If you are sitting there listening to my story, and you recognize the patterns of your own life in my words, I need you to pay very close attention. If you are watching this, and you are constantly draining yourself for family members who only see you as a convenient bank account or a permanent servant, it is time to stop. It is time to put down the heavy burden you have been carrying for people who refuse to carry themselves. You do not owe your financial security, your mental health, or your future to anyone who treats your sacrifices as a basic entitlement. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to close the door. You are allowed to protect your sanctuary. Society will try to guilt you. Manipulative relatives will try to shame you. They will tell you that family is everything and that blood is thicker than water. But blood does not excuse abuse. Shared genetics do not grant someone a free pass to destroy your life. Boundaries aren't a betrayal, they are absolute survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that is actively making you sick. You cannot thrive while you are permanently attached to people who view your growth as a threat to their control. Have you ever found yourself completely exhausted by the demands of toxic relatives? Have you ever had to summon the terrifying courage to finally cut off a family member who was pulling you under the water? I know how incredibly isolating and lonely that decision can feel. I know the quiet guilt that creeps in during the middle of the night. But I also know the magnificent, brilliant peace that follows the storm. Tell me your story in the comments below. I read them all, and I want to create a community where we can validate and support each other through these incredibly difficult transitions. Sharing your experience might be the exact thing someone else desperately needs to hear today to finally find their own courage. Please hit that like button to help this video reach the people who need it most right now. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this space of healing and truth together. And please let me know exactly where you are watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Your life belongs entirely to you. Your home is your castle. Your peace is your ultimate priority. Do not let anyone ever convince you that you are required to sacrifice your own joy to maintain a relationship that only brings you pain. You have the power to change the narrative of your life at any given moment. You just have to be brave enough to turn the deadbolt and finally walk away from the chaos. Until next time, please take care of yourself and remember you owe yourself the absolute loyalty you keep giving to the wrong people.